We descended toward the small town of Victorville, racing past Joshua trees, whose thick needle fists etched the sky gracefully and fiercely against the sunset. I knew then and there that I'd found my place, my calling, my landscape. I stuck my head out the car window and looked up. There was the evening star, a slice of moon alongside it. I was instantly and forever smitten. This was an empty and imposing land, rife with promise of danger and thrill. I sensed that an entirely new adventure lay in wait for our family there, where we intended to relocate to be near my father's new job. My intuitions were confirmed when my mother later opened a kitchen drawer to find a baby Mojave green rattlesnake inside. When I went to bed, serenaded by symphonies of coyotes every night. When my brother went to the hospital with dehydration after climbing a harsh rock peak near our house one August afternoon. The desert was as silent as a church during a funeral and as wide and open and empty as a schoolyard on a Sunday. But it was never, ever boring. Even as a child, I perceived this is a place of wilderness and possibility, of magic, of rock hunting and tortoise sightings, of flash floods and years when rain never falls. But perhaps more significantly, as I started to find, this is also a long peopled place, a people filled with lives and stories dating back to the land of memory. It is a land full of stories of courage, despair, and resignation, stories of hope fulfilled and dreams dissolved. The desert is not, as it's often been stereotyped, a waterless void. Thousands of springs and water holes grace it. They are often hidden, detectable only to the longtime desert resident who spots a lone cottonwood or sprig of weed in the Mojave, or a cluster of native Washingtonian fan palms tucked into deep canyons of the western Colorado desert. Just as it's been stereotyped, people who have made the desert home have been reduced often to two-dimensional caricatures in the annals of American history, and in a literary canon that tends to favor cities, farms, and forests. But with a little digging, one discovers that the literature of California's deserts is every bit as exuberant, varied, and charming as the literature of its more populated and gentrified sister regions. And I would argue, as important and meaningful and sophisticated. So you might be wondering by now, when we look at the book cover for No Place for a Puritan, the literature of California's deserts, just how this book came to be and why I took the initiative to pitch the idea for this book to Heyday Books in Berkeley, working with Malcolm Margolin, the legendary editor-publisher of this iconic California nonprofit press that dates back to the 1970s. I had been involved with the formation of something called the Inlandia Institute about 12 years ago, was invited to participate and help to form the Institute and also become an inaugural advisory committee member. And the Institute had published a book called Inlandia, which showcased their inland region, the Inland Empire of Southern California's literature. So I became involved with that book as an advisory committee member and noticed there were some pieces about the desert. And I just thought, wow, there needs to be an anthology for the whole desert. And so I pitched the book to Malcolm and he wonderfully agreed to let me go ahead with the book. So the book was published in 2009 and in conjunction with Heyday Santa Clara University California Legacy Series and the Inlandia Institute from Riverside. Also, one of my goals in putting together this book was to create an eclectic, iconic, enduring, but also interesting reader of desert stories and literature for my college students at College of the Desert in the Palm Springs region. I wanted to pick books or pick excerpts and stories and poems for my students so that they would be motivated to read about where they live. All the anthologies we seem to have access to were always about cities and other parts of the country, and I felt kind of frustrated that there wasn't something. So definitely I was attempting to create something that was an educational resource, something that's accessible to all people from all walks of life and diversities and backgrounds. And most of all, as I said before, just something that would grab people's attention. You pick up a section and dig in and find something by somebody and you get really excited. And then maybe a month later, you pick the book up and flip the pages and find something else to read. You might be wondering also what came up with the title for the book. Well, there's a poem that I found that was written in all my deep research for the book and the selections. My deep research came up with some very interesting and often obscure authors, people who had maybe spent a little time in the desert for whatever reason and written some great literature. And there was one poem by a man named William Justima, and the title of the poem is No Place for a Puritan. And somehow that just grabbed me. It just has so many different possibilities, symbolically, metaphorically, for what is the desert? Is this part of the American dream? Is it beyond it? Is it a place where you find religion, or a place that's sort of beyond religion, or maybe both? And this man, William Justima, born in 1905, came from Chicago. He served in World War II, and then afterwards he went out to spend time in Death Valley by himself, and he ended up writing a book of poems, believe it or not, and eventually went on to live in San Francisco and publish. After publishing the poems, he became a really well-known wallpaper and interior designer. So the desert is full of stories of people like this who wrote some great literature, but there's very interesting, eclectic people. So I'll read just a little bit from his poem. No place for a Puritan is the desert, no place to draw curtains, and what is a hymn in the open but a pity or a sin? Where God does not exist, invent him. Regard then the great American desert god, morbid and elegant, his kingdom almost emptied. The sea was here and left its shapes to wither. Only my aigrette or smoke tree, my rare flute bush show vividly the rush of water. And he just goes on in this meditation to continue to explore that idea. Is God here or is God not? The desert is a place that is so rich with so many indicators in life, and yet it can be so frustrating and empty and making us longing for more. California deserts. This picture you're looking at is actually in the Mojave Desert in an area called the Weethump Wilderness, which is towards the Colorado River, and you're looking out towards something called Abiquame, a peak which is known in another word as Spirit Mountain. California Desert is one of the 6 largely intact ecosystems left in the world, a land that has inspired a diversity of literature by an astonishing array of people from all walks of life in every genre imaginable. So we have novels, we have stories, we have oral histories from our Native American people here. We have essays, poetry, memoir, news articles, westerns, young adult books, narrated nonfiction. There are works by, just quickly, this is just a little poster from Death Valley back in the day when William Justima may have been spending time there, something we associate with Death Valley, the 20 mule teams carrying the borax and all the mining, Badwater Basin, one of the desert's more alluring places. And so just a few more slides real quick before I talk about some of the famous authors. Bombay Beach, recently, which is, there was a Bombay Beach Lit Fest scheduled to happen this last March, just last month, for the very first time. It's been postponed due to the pandemic, but they're hoping to reschedule and bring some great literature from writers from all over the country actually down here to do some great literature. The desert as a place of magic and intrigue, which inspires writers. Here's a little tiny nest tucked into a cholla cactus with a few cactus wren eggs in it. So the cactus wren, where there seems to be no life and life is inhospitable, we actually see one of our desert iconic birds enduring and actually doing really well with its nesting and eggs. And a datura in blossom this spring. And so far, all these pictures are by me out on my desert hikes and journaling and my own inspiration for stories and writing. So When we think about California desert literature, we often think what comes to mind are some of the more iconic, well-known, well-established works in the desert literature of California. So there's Mary Austin, The Land of Little Rain, published in the early 1900s, and definitely a very powerful, strong book. Good old Edward Abbey, many of you may be familiar with him. I would call him the rowdy, loud, beloved, sometimes antagonistic voice of not just the California deserts, but the southwestern deserts, well known, probably best known for Desert Solitaire. And in the Puritan book, I have an excerpt from Edward Abbey, where he spent a year in Death Valley, actually, in the early 1960s, and he worked as a bus driver, a school bus driver for the kids who lived in Death Valley, including a friend of mine who lives there. So if you do read the Puritan anthology at some point, you'll find a little bit from his journal there. We also cannot talk about California desert literature without including a nod to the infamous Hunter S. Thompson and his Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. We were 30 miles outside of Barstow when the drugs began to take hold. One of the best, most famous opening lines of any literature and American letters, and definitely what we call maybe the psychedelic journey into the heart of the American dream, which he investigated and looked for in the desert, actually the northernmost Mojave up in Las Vegas. So we do have a selection of the very opening chapters in the Puritan book from Hunter S. Thompson. We also have some really well-known American authors who we may not have associated too much with the California deserts. John Steinbeck, for example, in his very beloved book, Travels with Charlie. And there he is with Charlie before they took off on that 1960 cross-country road trip. One of the most elegant, powerful, inspirational selections, in my estimation, in all of American literature is where John Steinbeck passes through the Mojave Desert on his trip with Charlie, and he has a very cathartic, magical experience. Just the way he writes it about the desert being the source. Maybe when we get to a point where we're in a dystopian future, let's hope we're not, but that this could be the place where all life is regenerated. He's thinking about shooting some coyotes because all his life he's been trained to think that coyotes are vermin. And yet when he sees the coyotes out there in the hot desert sun, just trying to survive, he has a real change of heart and decides to leave them some dog food and just leave them alone. So if you do chance to read this book, I would recommend definitely making sure you read that excerpt from the Travels with Charlie. Joan Didion, iconic California writer, essayist, just all-time rock star American writer. She also had dabbled in a little bit of what I would call desert noir, desert, some really dark stuff in her novel, Play It As It Lays. And that's another book from which I have an excerpt from that in this book as well. We also have our wonderful U.S. Poet Laureate, just our last U.S. Poet Laureate, Juan Felipe Herrera, who gifted this book with a beautiful poem called Neon Desert Collage. And so many people would not maybe associate him with the deserts, but he's definitely written quite a bit about the desert. Your Desert and Mine, Nina Paul Shumway, is a very iconic, and I get people asking me questions about this, like people contacting me from other parts of the country. Wow, I heard about Nina Paul Shumway's book about being an early date family pioneer in the Coachella Valley. So I have an excerpt from this book in the Puritan anthology as well. And this is wonderful reading and very historically relevant to our region. We also might associate the desert in literature with some of the older, these are actually kind of legendary, they were at the time and they're even more legendary now. The Old Desert magazine, published by Randall Henderson back in the 1940s all the way until the 60s, and the magazine was picked up and published for another 10 or 15 years or so. And the Harry Oliver Desert Rats Scrapbook, a very interesting publication. It's clearly an old school thing, not still being published, but a really legendary publication. And Harry Oliver had actually worked in Hollywood as a cartoonist. He came out here from Hollywood and kind of created this really interesting Desert Rat Scrapbook. And there are some continuations of this idea with a few things that are published now, such as the Desert Oracle, and we have the Space Cowboy bookstore in Joshua Tree. So lots of people continue to have these sort of like really exciting new creative desert types of little publications. And we have increasingly a number of Native American books that are reflective of desert culture and life of our Cahuilla culture, our Chemehuevi, and other native cultures that have been here in the desert, and peoples going back at least for 9 or 10 centuries. And I would call these books very foundational for any, serious examination of California desert literature. So the book on the left is Katherine, Dr. Siva Saubel, the first part in her 2-volume series, which is her memoir, which was penned with the linguist Eric Elliott in both English and the Cahuilla language. And these are amazing books. I recommend, reading, getting copies of these from the Malki Museum and continuing to read more. And then we also had, so I have an excerpt from The Dried Coyote's Tale in the Puritan anthology. But the other 2 books, Cahuilla Dictionary, this is an earlier where Katherine had helped linguists from Germany going back to the 60s and 70s to help revive the Cahuilla language and record it before it was lost. And then we have Tamalpaq, a very famous, well-known book, co-authored by Katherine and Lowell Bean, one of our top, really iconic, legendary Cahuilla anthropologists. So we do have a little excerpt in the book, which I'll read from today. We also have our desert visionaries, the iconic, amazing holy man, Leonard Knight, down in Salvation Mountain, and that is a whole story in itself. And unfortunately, I was not able to include anything by Leonard in the Desert Anthology, but would love to write more about him. So let's talk about how I organized the book and the contents. There were 7 sections to the book that I came up with my editor that I worked with at Heyday. Based on, I started pulling in all these different, I was photocopying from books, and we had a huge stacks everywhere. And Malcolm up at Heyday was like, well, we only can publish so much. We have to take a lot of things out. So you might notice that some things are missing that you'd like to see in here, but I'm actually hoping to do a new volume at some point, or to expand on this edition at some point. So, and of course, there have been more books published since this came out. The body of desert literature continues to grow and evolve. So we ended up looking at thematic ideas that seem to recur throughout a lot of desert literatures. And so we have to start with the dangers of the desert. Dangers of the desert is an abiding theme and inspiration for a lot of desert literature that is written. The desert can definitely be a very dangerous place, and that makes good writing. I would just like to add that the desert is not a backdrop in most desert writing. The desert is actually a force, a character, a literary agent. The desert makes things happen. Sometimes the desert is a protagonist or a heroic force. It can also be an antagonist, sort of an anti-hero, anti-force. And in many cases, it can be both. But there's something about the desert that has really made it one of the most inspirational, unforgettable, imprinted landscapes in the world. Gets under your skin and never leaves you alone. And we see many literary tropes that occur in other American and world literatures played out vividly in the desert. And we also see some literary tropes that are even maybe a little bit, that lend themselves better to the desert than maybe other places. So dangers of the desert, how has it been written about? A forbidding land, arid, resources are widely spread. We have heat, flash flood, all kinds of dangers. You could step on a rattlesnake, you can get lost. So I will read just a little bit from one of the desert authors in the Dangers of the Desert section of the book. And this one is by a rather obscure author named Edwin Corle, C-O-R-L-E. Born in New Jersey, came out to the desert became one of these people that moved to the desert from the East Coast, fall in love with it, and end up writing about it. His books include Mojave, a Book of Stories, published in 1934, Fig Tree John, published in 1935, and Desert Country, published in 1941. And here's a short excerpt from Desert Country. If you don't get excited, the forked stick stopped deftly over the snake's body just back of the head. The reptile was effectively pinned to the sandy bottom of the dry wash. Banning, holding the stick, looked down in concentrated admiration at the prize. The snake, a red diamond rattler, indigenous to the Colorado Desert of southeastern California, about 5 feet in length or perhaps a few inches short of that mark, seemed stunned, unable to comprehend a new experience. It made no violent movements at all and showed no special fear, and only a slight waving of the tail and a rapid shooting in and out of its black-blue tongue evinced its dull but mounting anger. Banning congratulated himself on his skill. The snake itself couldn't have struck with more accuracy than he had done in capturing it. And moreover, the stick apparently had in no way injured it. "Hello, baby," Banning said aloud, maintaining his grip on the stick to keep the reptile down firmly, but taking care not to exert too great pressure on the back of its neck. So this short piece, I'll just tell you, I don't have time to read it all. This is sort of a man versus nature, where man goes out and thinks, I have it under control. I'm just going to go catch some rattlesnakes and sell them at a market. And he ends up not getting bit by the big giant snake that he just catches. But on the way back to the car, he slips and trips and he gets bit on the hand by a little tiny baby sidewinder. So this sort of evokes a little bit of Jack London, maybe the man going out into nature who doesn't really pay attention and thinks he knows it all, but the desert bites him in the you-know-what. Another section of the book is, well, let me just quickly show you a few more pictures that events the idea of getting lost or having dangers in the desert overcome you. Many people get lost in the California desert. Some of the greatest literature is stories of people being lost. And I personally know somebody who got lost in the desert and wrote a book about it, and thankfully he survived. This is a recurring theme both in real life and literature. And this is the entrance to Tahquitch Canyon in Palm Springs, home of the god Tahquitz, who is not to be messed with and a very powerful force in the Kauai spiritual tradition and life. Desert crossings, another very, very prominent theme in desert literature. Survival, going from water source to water source. An increase of the frontier thesis, the manifest destiny, I'm sorry, not increase, but extension of the principles of American colonialism and go west, young man, westward expansion, starting with the Spaniards coming for resources and riches and gold, and subsequently the pioneers in the 19th century, the Manly Party getting lost in the desert and surviving. And even today, desert crossings create some pretty legendary stories. So I'm going to read just a little bit from one of the desert crossings of a very well-known author who some people also would not associate with the desert, but who actually lived in the Mojave Desert for a number of years and was inspired by the desert to the point of affiliating his desert writing with his experiments in the 1950s with hallucinogenics, and also with subsequent work that he wrote, some of his dystopian novels, and this would be the amazing and great Aldous Huxley. So this is from one of his essays, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, published in 1956. The facts of silence and emptiness are traditionally the symbols of divine immanence, but not, of course, for everyone and not in all circumstances. Until one has crossed a barren desert without food or water under a burning tropical sun at 3 miles an hour, one can form no conception of what misery is. These are the words of a gold seeker who took the southern route to California in 1849. Even when one is crossing it at 70 miles an hour on a 4-lane highway, the desert can seem formidable enough. To the 49ers, it was an unmitigated hell. Women and men who are at her mercy find it hard to see in nature and her works any symbols but those of brute power at the best, and at worst of an obscure and mindless malice. The desert's emptiness and the desert's silence reveal what we may call their spiritual meanings only to those who enjoy some measure of physiological security. Excuse me. The security may amount to no more than St. Anthony's hut and daily ration of bread and vegetables, no more than Milarepa's cave and barley meal and boiled nettles, less than what any sane economist would regard as the indispensable minimum, but still security, still a guarantee of organic life, and along with life, the possibility of spiritual liberty and transcendental happiness. But even for those who enjoy security against the assaults of the environment, the desert does not always or inevitably reveal its spiritual meanings. So this is a really great piece from the book where he goes on that same idea of the desert can be a great giver, the desert can also be a great taker, and you never quite know what the desert is going to dish up to you. Some more desert crossings. Roy's Cafe out on Highway 66, the famous transcontinental highway. And would like to just mention again that John Steinbeck had memorably written one of the chapters from The Grapes of Wrath, crossing, and he would have inevitably, the Joad family would have crossed through the area where Roy's Cafe is now today, which is a sort of a semi-ghost town that has had a little bit of revival, but is still somewhat empty. And the desert crossings of our areas, the desert's indigenous people who have known for decades every inch of this desert, have many trails crisscrossing the deserts, very often going from waterhole to waterhole, oasis to oasis. And definitely there's a big difference between what we see in desert literature, the stories of native people who really had their desert crossings. It was a manageable, endurable, sustainable thing, to some of the desert crossings that have happened where people die. But the idea of crossing the desert is still just a very compelling trope in desert literature. The next section in the book is the lure of the desert. This is a big, big theme, particularly in the 19th century going into the 20th and 21st. People began to be drawn to the California deserts for aesthetic reasons, cultural reasons, health and medicine. The film industry really kind of came out here and has never left. The arts, music, celebrity culture, this wanting to experience something that's otherworldly, visionaries, inspirations, a place cherished by eccentrics and loners and seekers. In the weekend getaway, today's society, we have the Airbnb. We've always had this thing of the Wild West being a draw for people to come here. So in the lure of the desert section, we see a lot of this. People coming to the desert because they want something alternative, something beautiful, something inspirational. And it's just one of the enduring and main themes that we see. So in the lure of the desert, we have a piece from an author named Enid Schomer, who from her book about the politician and the she flew planes in World War II, from the book The Life of Jacqueline Cochran. And she's not well known, but her life story is just incredible. So Enid had written a poem as a tribute to Jackie Cochran. In the desert, there is a woman, in the moon tonight, hazy as the last breath I once saw fogging a mirror when a mill worker died. She dips her toothless jaw into a thin gruel of clouds and is not nourished. God rested here in the desert after creation. He wanted to empty himself of all those designs for fin, thorn, and claw. He was sick of the gap-toothed smile of mountains, the insistent wishing of streams. Whenever I find the skull of an animal, I tell myself it's a bead. He rubbed himself to sleep now. I want to empty myself like that. I want to fall all the way in the desert to the ordinary. And another book that just really, another poem that just beautifully captivates that lure of the desert sensibility is from the poet Dick Barnes, who is not a well-known poet in the literary canon of poetry, but really wrote some amazing poetry when he was writing in the second half of the 20th century. And his poems are very, very, I think some of among the best that I've read about the Mojave Desert. This poem is called Song Mojave Narrows. To say that death is a river, and my love for you a star reflected in the river, that the river has worn a channel through boulders and flows, north and east from the forks, 100 miles without tributaries. To say a dry lake is a mirror, where the river gives itself up to sky. So those selections are from The Lure of the Desert. And of course, one of the lures of the desert is to find water. Finding water in the desert is, as a desert dweller myself, it's just such an amazing, you almost want to cry if you've been on a hot hike, like this one to Tahquitz Falls, and you're hiking in the heat and the rocks and you just find a body of water. And water in the desert has definitely inspired a lot of writing. Making the desert home is our next section. And the earliest stories of our Quia, Chemehuevi, Serrano, Shoshone peoples have shown and continue to show that the California deserts have been a rich in terms of resource and sustenance and life-giving and sustainability if tended and cared for being able to live peacefully and in harmony with resources. So this picture is actually of a woman known as Panamint Annie, who was an early miner in the Death Valley region, came from wealth and privilege in the East Coast and decided to live in the desert. And there's many stories such as this one. One of the more tragic tales of the desert, and sort of an emerging controversial in the telling of the story, what really happened, is the story of Willie Boy, some of you may be familiar with. And Harry Lawton, a historian who taught at UC Riverside, wrote the book. It's written in the Western genre, so it's like a Louis L'Amour type of book, called Willie Boy, A Desert Manhunt. And I'll just read a little bit from that from the Puritan anthology. Tuesday, October 5th, 1909. Willie Boy had been running since daybreak, darting along at a slow, even pace westward through the brush. Occasionally he startled a jackrabbit, and then both of them would run together a short way, until suddenly the rabbit would bound off abruptly at right angle, and he would once again be racing on alone. He was exhausted from the previous day's run, and although he had slept in the warm sand beneath a stand of mesquite the night, winds and colder temperatures had numbed his body. His cramped legs throbbed as they jarred against the ground. He kept turning his head to glance back to the east, where he believed the posse had made camp at Surprise Springs. Once he thought he detected a group of riders moving through the brush far away, but then they disappeared into the rolling plain, and the interval between their appearance and departure was so short, he wondered if he had imagined them. He had eaten nothing since the afternoon before. There was a steady, persistent ache in the belly, and his tongue was thick. So among the themes in the Refuge and Exile section of this book, not all the Refuge and Exile are happy stories, and this is not one of the happy stories. People have been drawn to the desert, hiding from the city, the law, from racism, displacement, especially of our native people, racism, genocide, as in the forced exile of Japanese Americans to the externment camps, including one in the Mojave Desert located at Manzanar, poverty, gender limits. There are stories of women such as Panamint Annie who could not accept the confines of Victorian roles for women. So being able to come to the desert and just be your own person and kind of buck all the trends. There's also, just want to mention one of our local Mojave Desert writers, Susan Lang, who wrote a trilogy of books about her mother's experience homesteading in Pioneer Town. Another one of the great stories of a young woman coming to the desert to kind of throw off the restraints of society. We also have immigrant stories coming from Latin America. A great story from Victor Villaseñor, writing about immigrants crossing and dying in the great deserts of California in pursuit of the American dreams. So the next slide we have another retelling of the Willie story. You can find this at the 29 Palms Oasis Visitor Center at the National Park, a beautiful series of artwork and storyline, and that tells the story of the Willie story through the eyes of Carlota Willie's tragic lover who was part of the run from the law and ended up tragically dying on that flight. So definitely, you might want to do more investigation into this story. Making the desert home, another theme of desert literature that's found in the literature book. Many people have come to make the desert home. Some were always here, some still are, some came for a little while, some people come for just to live their whole lives. And I wanted to read a piece in this section from the anthology that I think most powerfully states a connection, a very deep and abiding connection to the California desert in the truest sense of home. And this is a Chemehuevi quiche made out of natural materials. This is my friend Barbara Durham, who is the tribal historian for the Timbisha Shoshone in Death Valley, along with some beautiful basketry from the tribe. And I'm actually going to read an excerpt from her aunt Paulina Steeves, who lobbied for the tribal recognition and homeland so they could remain in their homeland, which part of which is the Death Valley region. There had been a lot of challenges with the US government and the National Park Service for many decades, where they were actually sort of trying to exile these Timbisha. And thanks to the efforts of Pauline and others, they were able to get their tribal recognition and land designated to them. Shoshone Indian Homeland Statement to Congress from Paulina Steeves. The word Timbisha refers to a red material found in the Black Mountains, not far from our tribal village at Furnace Creek. Our ancestors, the old ones, used this material, called ochre in English. They would use it like paint on their faces to protect them and heal them. The old ones believed that this material, Timbisha, strengthened their spirituality. Our people, the Timbisha, are named after this material, and so is our valley. The term Death Valley is unfortunate. We refrain from talking about death. Instead, we refer to one who it has happened to. Even more importantly, this is a place about life. It is a powerful and spiritual valley that has healing powers, and the spirituality of the valley is passed on to our people. Our people have always lived here. The creator Apu placed us here at the beginning of time. This valley and the surrounding places that the old ones frequented is Tupa'a, our homeland. The Timbisha homeland includes the valley and the nearby mountains and the springs, flats, meadows, and more. Then others came and occupied our land. They gave us disease and some of our people died. They took away many of our most important places, the springs, the places we used for food, the places we used for our spiritual practices. They didn't want us to carry on our religion or our ceremonies or our songs or our language. The names of our places became unknown to some of our people, but we never gave up. The Timbisha people have lived in our homeland forever, and we will live here forever. We were taught that we don't end. We are part of our homeland, and it is part of us. We are people of the land. We don't break away from what is part of us. And here is a Native American geoglyph that is actually in a remote part of the desert. Just one of the archaeologic signifiers of people having lived here and passed through here, dating back many decades. The changing desert, a new type of beast. So starting with colonialization, westward expansion, and continuing even until today, populations continue to impact the desert, but not just populations of people. The desert has become a very highly sought after place for tourism, exploration, music festivals, all kinds of increasingly large-scale events, and people just wanting to come here. However, there is a problem in terms of sustainability and balancing the resources. And this has sort of been an ongoing, emerging subgenre that's been written about in a lot of environmental desert writing. And there's been quite a bit of that emerging in the last decade or two since the book was published. So no longer has the desert just been a place to fear or just a wasteland, sort of a exotic land to go. The desert has been increasingly seen as a place to exploit and extract from in terms of large-scale resource extraction. Has the desert been tamed and gentrified? Will it become something that is no longer the exotic, magical place we see? Can we continue to extract water, both groundwater and aquifers, such as the ongoing struggle with the water at Cadiz? will the desert be rendered into a basic dystopian wasteland? So there's the last two sections of the book kind of, well, not to mention nuclear experimentations and the atomic bomb and the proposed Ward Valley nuclear radiation storage site that was fortunately shut down a couple decades ago. So the last two sections of the book, The Changing Beast is one of those, talking about how quickly the land is changing and how people are adapting. So a quick section from Katherine Siva Saubel's memoir autobiography called The Problem with Windmills in this section. This is the way it was long ago with the wild plants which we, the residents of Palm Springs, used to gather. They used to gather them here. They used to gather those things, those barrel cactus blossoms. The white man had a name for that place. The Cahuilla had a name for it. I don't remember the Cahuilla name. The white man refers to it as Devil's Garden. Nothing but barrel cactus used to grow over there. We used to go over there to gather barrel cactus blossoms. We would pick a lot of them. And then in the winter, my mother, God rest her soul, would boil them. First, she would dry them. She would dry them thoroughly and store them away. And then later in the winter, she would soak them in water. And when they were ready to eat again, we would eat them. That's the way it was until white men got here. They pulled them all up. Who knows where they put them? They said, I'm going to give them to the Indians. They called me here. They asked whether Indians wanted those barrel cactus and said they're going to take them to their homes. Yes, I said, you can bring some over here to us and take some over to the east at Torres Martinez Reservation. It grows well over there in the east at Torres Martinez. So Katherine was referencing the beginning of the development of windmills in Palm Springs. So I really like that selection because when we see windmills driving into Palm Springs, and that's a very kind of iconic vision and site that's been widely photographed about Palm Springs, we also see there was an ecological environmental disturbance that occurred at that site. And one of the bigger issues now with the windmill and other large-scale renewable energy sightings is many are taking place in pretty much pristine desert wildlands. So I would encourage you to really learn more about that, and more and more people are writing about what's happening and the struggle between developing renewable energy, but also not desecrating what remains of our desert wildlands. And we see a little bit of early development of townships in the California desert, the Apple Valley Inn circa 1940s, Roy Rogers. And this is where I happen to grow up. The inn is still there, but it's not in function right now. It's sort of just a big abandoned building. This is a Google view of the Coachella Valley, which looks like golf. Doesn't look like the desert too much anymore. So these are some of the emerging concerns of desert literature. And finally, we have the final section of the book, Conserving and Protecting the Deserts. And just a few slides showing some of the efforts that people have made in recent years in person and also in writing to defend the desert from incursions and development, and to actually increase the protection of desert wildlands and sacred places. So I'm just going to read, to wrap up my reading and lecture, just a little short excerpt in one of the final pieces from the book from an amazing writer named Barry Lopez, who had written a book called Desert Notes, River Notes, published in 1990. And his piece called The Stone Horse is about his journey deep into the desert to look for a geoglyph, or the other word for this is intaglio. A BLM archaeologist told me with understandable reluctance where to find the intaglio. I spread my Automobile Club of Southern California map of Imperial County out on his desk, and he traced the route with a pink felt tip pen. The line crossed Interstate 8 and then turned west along the Mexican border. You can't drive any farther than about here, he said, marking a small X. There's boulders in the wash. You have to walk up past them. It's tough to spot them in case you know what's there. Once you pick it up, he shook his head slowly in a gesture of wonder at its existence. I waited until I held his eye. I assured him I would not tell anyone else how to get there. He looked at me in stoical despair, like a man who had been robbed twice, whose belief in human beings was offered without conviction. I waited until 4 a.m. the next morning and drove south from El Centro. I traversed the stone plain as directed, but in spite of the frankness of the land, I came on the horse intaglio unaware. In the first moment of recognition, I was without feeling. I recalled later being startled and that I held my breath. It was laid out on the ground with its head to the east, 3 times life size. As I took in its outline, I felt a growing concentration of all my senses, as though my attentiveness to the pale rose color of the morning sky and other peripheral images had now been ceased to be important. I was aware that I was straining for sound in the windless air, and I felt the uneven pressure of the earth hard against my feet. The horse, outlined in a standing profile on the dark ground, was as vivid before me as a bed of tulips. I felt I had stepped into an unoccupied corridor. So Barry goes on to talk about a deep meditation on how the stone horse geoglyph intaglio came there and what was the origin of it, why was it there, and just the magic and wonder of being able to find something so connected to a deep history and past of people in the desert. So to wrap up my talk, I would just like to add a little bit of a joke. Somebody had asked on Instagram, what is the most boring thing about our national parks? And this particular phrase became we went viral, that somebody had complained on Yelp that the only thing to do here is walk around the desert. So many of us would say, yeah, that's exactly why we come to the desert, or like to read about the desert. And this is the wrap up of my presentation. And I think now we're going to be going to some question and answer. Thank you for listening. Hello?
Hi, yes, we are here. Thank you so much, Joan. I'm sorry, Ruth. We are not seeing any typed questions right now, so I want to remind folks that you can type a question into your screen, or if you want to, I'll go ahead and unmute everyone, and that way you'll have a chance to, we'll unmute you from this end, and then you'll have a chance to unmute yourself on your own phone and ask questions. It's funny, Ruth, you put me into a little bit of a reverie about words and deserts, and wonderful. I myself don't have questions. I'm just floating along, but I will go ahead and unmute folks.
Wonderful.
And so folks, you are all now unmuted from this end. And so if you want to unmute yourself on your phones or computers and ask questions of Ruth, or comment on the presentation and literature, please go ahead. I have a question for park staff, and we might not have the right park folks on the line. I think I have heard that the park is going to replace the Willie Boy story that is currently at the Oasis of Mara. And I'm wondering if anybody from the park wants to speak to the process for that, or whether that's happening. Oh, okay, and we are having some questions show up now. First question is, what was the name of the Barry Lopez piece?
The name of the Barry Lopez piece is, I'll look it up. Barry Lopez piece is called The Stone Horse, from the Stone Horse.
All right, another question is there any of your own writing in the book? And if so, what is your theme there?
Oh, just quickly, I want to finish on the Barry Lopez.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Barry Lopez was an essay called The Stone Horse, published in Antaeus magazine in 1986. So I'm not sure if you can find that. The whole essay is included in this book, in the Puritan book. We had the permission to reprint the essay. My own writing is in the book. In addition to my introduction, I had one of my desert poems, and the poem is basically based on an experience where I took my young daughter, who was then 3 years old, and we just went on a drive way out into the Mojave Desert to the Kelso Sand Dunes, which is in what is now the East Mojave National Preserve. And I was just thinking, she was talking about wanting to go hike the sand dunes, and I said, well, we don't know how stable they are, and they're farther away than you think and bigger than you think. And that sort of gave me the inspiration to do a little meditative, metaphorical interplay with the idea of our ideas of what we think the desert are very shifting and unstable, and that many people have come to the desert, including pioneers and miners, thinking they're going to find gold and treasures. But just when you think you're there, the desert, just shifts on you. You see a mirage and it disappears. So the desert is sort of a trickster in a way. That's what my poem is about.
Nice. And we do have someone willing to speak on what's happening at the Oasis of Mara. Joe, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, this is Joe Lombard, and I'm a visual information specialist in the Office of Communications in the park. Hi. And we are working currently with all of the tribes on the 15 traditionally associated tribes of the park to redo 15 waysides along that trail. And we will be removing all of the waysides that are currently there. We have a first draft of the waysides right now. They've been reviewed by the tribes and we've received some comments. And so we're working on a second draft. And we also had a site visit scheduled with them for tomorrow to be on site to look at the draft panels that we had to postpone, of course. Right. So we're working right now. The main impetus has been that the feeling was that the Willie Boy story on there really only represented one particular group of people, and it left out the connection of all of these other people to the Oasis, all of our other tribes. And so the tribes wanted the park to take a more inclusive approach that talked about the Oasis of Mara in terms of it's as a home, as a place to hunt, as a place to intermarry, as a place to trade, all of these things that happen between the different cultural groups in the area, and have it have a more broad appeal, and also have it have a strong stordship focus and care of the land focus too. So that's the status of that.
Well, thank you for letting me know that. Yeah, the Willie story is a very touchy, controversial, very, it definitely provides, that's another one of my scholarly research topics. I've done a lot of research, and I'm trying to stay very current on the evolving evolution of how the story is portrayed. And it's good to know that the Oasis is, these plans are in motion to have the tribes represent and to, let people know what the Oasis means and has always meant for a lot of our desert people, and not just the site of something tragic happened. So, yeah. And I'm sure you're also working with Dr. Clifford Trapser. Are you, in his wonderful book that he did incredible research and worked directly with tribal members of the Southern Paiute in his book called A Chumwevi Song, which he published several years ago. And he goes into great length in doing sort of a revised, more deeply accurate historical rendering of the Oasis, as well as the events that transpired with the Willie incident.
Okay, thanks. I was unaware of that. I appreciate that information.
Yeah, I didn't talk about it in my lecture today because, his book was written after I did the Puritan book. But if I'm hopefully to do a more updated version of the Puritan anthology, I would definitely be including some excerpts from the Chumwevi Songbook by Dr. Clifford Trapser.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would be happy to connect with you and share any resources I have or information about other books too that I could possibly, let you know about or connect you with.
Great. Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, well, Ruth, thank you for being here today.
Absolutely.
And thank you to the audience. This afternoon's webinar at 3 o'clock will be with Chris Smith and Jeremy Yoder on the Joshua Tree Genome Project. The Joshua Tree Genome Project aims to identify Joshua Tree genes responsible for adaptation to climate and to develop genetic information that will aid in the long-term conservation planning. On Wednesday, April the 29th, a week from today, we'll have Kurt Leusner giving a presentation on amazing desert insects. Of course, you can see all of our webinar recordings on the Desert Institute YouTube channel. All you have to do is Google Desert Institute at Joshua Tree National Park on YouTube, and you can see all of ours. Today's presentations will be uploaded tomorrow. One more note, if any of the audience would like to learn more about how to use this platform to create webinar series, please contact me and we'll make you a co-producer so that you can practice and learn how to participate with us. Until then, please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.